for being here for the workshop, Seeking Hope, Seeking Holiness, Same-Sex Attraction, and the Dignity of the Human Person. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Deacon Jim Russell. Deacon Jim is a lifelong St. Louis resident, cradle Catholic, husband, father of 11, and grandfather of 2, with one more on the way. Deacon Jim serves as Family Life Coordinator for the Archdiocese of St. Louis. He previously worked in full-time parish ministry for the last 14 years. An active supporter of and participant in Catholic radio, Deacon Russell's theological interests include the sanctity of marriage and the works of Pope St. John Paul II, particularly on the theology of the body. Please join me in welcoming to the microphone Deacon Jim Russell.
All right. Thank you very much. And just by way of clarification, the one on the way is a grandchild, just in case someone had thought, he's already got 11. Why does he need number 12? So we are here at a wonderful conference, an annual opportunity to talk about the dignity of the human person. And that indeed is what brings us here, even in this particular setting with this particular topic, which deals with same-sex attraction and that human dignity. Before I get started, I want to just sort of mention the manner of the presentation so that when it comes to time for your turn, you'll be prepared. You know, the axiom that applies pastorally of meeting people where they are, right? And that's what we, priests, deacons, clergy, pastoral ministers, we try to do that. And usually that's a wonderful thing one-on-one because you get a chance to literally meet people where they are. In a group like this, I'm not going to presuppose that I know where you are, particularly on this subject. So what I've chosen to do to address that simple axiom is the second half of our time together is yours. So the first half, I'm going to lay out some content. And then in the second half, I want to meet you where you are. I want to hear your questions and hopefully offer something tangible back to you to help you understand not only what we're talking about now, but how to move forward after we're done. What this might be in terms of another stepping stone forward in the realm of understanding and sort of managing in our own lives those opportunities, those moments that come to us in the realm of same-sex attraction and how we can help people who are experiencing a great deal of suffering in their lives because of this. So does that sound fair? I'm going to get the first half done hopefully in 30 minutes or less. And then after that, you're going to tell me where you are, basically. The second point is, what about the content today? One of the things that I think is so very important, particularly in a subject like this, is the scriptural admonition that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. When we look at what the church teaches us, not only in this arena of same-sex attraction, homosexuality, gender ideology, those things, but for everything, the necessary first step is truth. It's reality. It's the idea that we can apprehend, we can see in our own field of vision as individual human beings, the truth. And so from that experience comes the next steps that we are, I think, all more interested in a sense, which is the experience of love, the experience of authentic freedom. Those two realities come only from when we possess the truth. So both love and freedom depend really utterly on our possession of the truth. And so at the end of this, my hope is that it's an invitation to love more deeply and more freely, particularly in this arena, so that it's not just going to be a head conversation, but it's going to be a conversation that directs us into our hearts as well. So with having said that, we'll start talking in sort of introductory terms about our subject. Homosexuality. In our lived lives of folks who have lived in the last 5 decades or so, we've seen culture really shift on this particular issue. What makes this a life issue is that we are speaking of what Sister so eloquently spoke of in our keynote, the very dignity of the human person. We want love and authentic freedom, not only for ourselves, but for our brothers and sisters as well. And what we see happening in our culture right now is a rejection of the authentic human dignity that we in the church seek to preserve in order to safeguard this sacred truth that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that we are His possession, and that our freedom comes from saying yes to His plan for us. So what we have in culture is the normalization of homosexuality. And this may sound harsh, but again, it's meant in the context of what I have come to refer to as truth love, truth-love, truth spoken in love, love given in truth. It works both ways, particularly if you were to look at Pope Benedict XVI's wonderful encyclical on truth in charity, Veritas in Caritate. It's a great exposition of that idea, this two-way street of truth and love. So when we do that, we participate in the culture of life. What I was about to say that might sound a little harsh is that the normalization of homosexuality has taken on the mantle of the culture of death, because anything that brings us away from God's plan is not a step toward life, it's a step away from it. So that's what we're looking to kind of unpack in our time together. And as we move forward, 4 things. If there are really 3 words, I'll trim it down, that you come away with as sort of on your radar right now. We're going to look at 3 things before we get into chastity. First, ideology. That's number 1. Second, anthropology. Number 2. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about desensitization. It's a hard word to say, but it's pretty easy. It's the slowly boiling frog, right? So, and then we're going to start talking about how we respond to those 3 realities, those 3 experiences of our historical truth that we're living. So ideology, what's the difference between ideology and truth? Well, ideology is a system of ideas, right? And when you create a system of ideas, most of the time when it's labeled ideology, it's because it's limping and not running toward the finish line, right? Ideology generally has something wrong with it, something not based in reality. In fact, through the teaching documents of the church, most of the time there's a very sort of critical stance that the magisterium takes toward anything that would be labeled ideology. And so we have that in this dimension of studying human sexuality. So these ideologies are dangerous when they're not properly grounded in reality. Pope Francis himself has taken note of this by using a term that we might know of, that you might have heard, called ideological colonization. Have you kind of heard that around the edges, maybe on his pressers on the plane trips back to the Vatican? Oftentimes when he's asked questions along these lines, he'll speak of this idea. What would it mean to colonize ideologically? Basically, it means that people in authority are using that to inject or insert ideological thinking into the culture, into the lives of those under that authority. Oftentimes, Pope Francis refers to the colonization of our schools, our education of our children. This is particularly what he has said about gender theory or gender ideology. It's a colonization that is taking place that is contrary to the dignity of the human person. So that gets us a little bit further. But here's maybe one of the surprise moments of the hour we're spending together. You may not ever have thought of the concept of sexual orientation as an ideology. Ideology, orientation ideology. We're currently hearing a lot about gender ideology. And the reason that it's important to step back a moment and see this concept this system that has been in place as a social construct really just for the last, 150 years at the most, in terms of how we look at our human sexuality. The reason I'm saying orientation is an ideology, well, it's because it's how the church understands this to be the case as well. Because what happens in culture's thinking, the reason that it's important to let an attraction be seen as something we're oriented to is because it relativizes, right, the idea of God's plan and everything else. What's God's plan for human sexuality? It's ordered toward marriage. It's ordered toward complementarity, man and woman, etc., etc. We'll get into a bit more of this when we get into anthropology. But right now, orientation needs to kind of come into focus as a sort of a bankrupt concept because it's elevating what is not part of God's plan and making it seem as though it's either equivalent to or just another flavor of human experience that is then we're able to justify and we're able to build on that concept socially. So far, so good. We're making some sense that this is what's in focus. So we have orientation ideology to consider. And that pairs up with our thinking currently in culture about gender. The idea that gender theory, that there is this concept of gender that is somehow able to be moved away from or separated from sex as male, female, man, woman. This is another form of ideology, and you'll find many more examples, even in Pope Francis's talks, where he uses the term ideology to describe this phenomenon. But it's because of these successful colonizations of these ideologies that we have found ourselves where we are today, and it's one of the reasons why there's been a very slippery slope when it comes to gender theory and the whole transgender political social piece and the phenomenon that we're dealing with right now. So having that on the table then brings us to the next reality about ideology. It's who I am, we are told. This is an ideology of identity in both orientation and gender, okay? And in that regard, we have to grapple with the fact that our attractions and our emotions, so attractions in the realm of orientation or same-sex attraction, and our emotions in terms of how we feel about who we are, these are not identities. The feelings are not identities. But socially and politically, identities are very useful, you see. And this is where we see ideology at work in our environment and the landscape in which we're living. Because we see if I have this experience or attraction or emotion, and if I can claim that that is who I am, then I can look to others who are part of the same community. The community then takes on the identity of minority. The minority then takes on the identity of political force. And then from that, we see in the last 30, 40 years what we have seen just last year in the Supreme Court decision, for example, regarding same-sex marriage. We see the connections there between what we experience, and if we say that's who I am, then all of these other features come into place. So having said all of that, it is the church and our adherence to the truth about human nature that's fundamentally opposed to these identity claims. And we have to stand with the church in understanding that what we experience, quote unquote, what we experience is not, quote unquote, who we are. Okay? So we stand with the church in rejecting that line of thinking. We do not reject the dignity of the human person in anything that we say about this particular issue, which is, we'll get into that in just a moment as well. So we are shifting gears now into anthropology, all right? So I didn't really say buckle up, it's going to be a quick ride, but I'm trying to make it a quick ride. So if questions are forming, jot them down in the margins or make a mental note, because we want to hear those questions, particularly at the end of our session. So what do we say about anthropology? Who we are, how God made us. What is it? What does it mean to be a human person? One of the keys in same-sex attraction, and in really all forms of that, whether we're talking about homosexuality or even issues that have to deal with gender dysphoria or gender identity issues, things that are part of that arena, we see in the church's thinking and the direct teaching in the catechism on homosexuality, the idea that there is a psychological genesis that is part of this reality. And it's even in the Catechism 2357, where it says that this psychological genesis in the case of same-sex attraction is, quote unquote, largely unexplained, right? Because we don't know a lot about the origin of it. But it's important to say with the church that there is a psychological origin for the condition in the same way that the church understands the term psychology. So we understand that it is a condition that arises from some disturbance of some kind in the psyche, the soul of the human person. When the church speaks of psychology, it really speaks well beyond the discipline that we know today as sort of the scientific discipline of psychology, because the church has been taking care of the quote-unquote science of the soul for centuries. All you have to do is read some of Aquinas' Summa on how he treats the soul, and say, my gosh, this is a tremendous comprehension of what's going on in not only the human mind, but in all dimensions of the human soul. So this long-standing system of understanding is what we are referencing when we say there's a psychological genesis for these experiences that people have on the inside, right? And this is so important because we see our bodies. We know we have bodies. We kind of know we have souls, right? It's hard to really spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that we are body-souls. We're composite natures. God has given us a human nature that is body-soul, body-soul. So it's important that we recognize as a fundamental aspect of who we are, that in addition to our bodies, our souls are hugely important, not just in terms of a moral sense, which we often think about. It's like, did I do right, did I do wrong? But all of the things that are happening in our heads, quote unquote, are happening in our souls. Our thoughts, our choices, our emotions, the things we apprehend and see, it's all happening in our souls. And so this is where we need to stay with the church's understanding of the human person. Alongside of those things that sort of happen in our heads, we also have what we understand to be natural appetites, right? In terms of being an animal creature, a created body, we have things that are part of that. A desire for food, right? Sort of the natural appetites that we don't have any willful control over when they happen to us. This also includes the realm of sexual appetite. The idea that the root of our experience of sexual attraction is in how God makes us. So one such basic drive, this God-given natural attraction to the other sex, man for woman and woman for man. This is a universal reality for the human person, for human nature as it is created by God. We're born that way, all right? And human sexual love is meant to arise from this. This is a key component. Now, what happens to that is that the root of the homosexual inclination, for example, it's not properly ordered to this good that is made as part of who we are. And it's very, very difficult from case to case to get any real clear understanding as why this might be an experience that this person has. But what we can say, based on our anthropology, based on what we know of the human person, is that God's plan was that eros, right, this idea of sexual love, was to be between man and woman, woman and man, not between man and man, woman and woman. At its basic fundamental reality, this is because the experience of sexual attraction ultimately, as a final end in this whole range of experiences, is about making babies. It's very pro-life, put it that way, right? It's truly why we're made, procreation, creating with God. And the whole arc of our sexual existence has that as its end. It's to be life-giving and fruitful in that way, in a totally faithful context. So with all of that on the plate, let's go a little bit further. I'm really running out of my own time clock here. I got 9 minutes to land the plane in 30. So here we go. So with this in mind, we look at what does it mean to have a sexual identity. The simple truth there is it's not as complicated as the ideologies of culture would have us believe. There are two: man, woman. If you're looking to understand what in the Catechism, when it speaks of chastity, which we're about to get to, sexual identity is what we're supposed to integrate into everything else in our existence. It's not that we're supposed to integrate our self-proclaimed identity in terms of gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, whatever. That's not what the church means by sexual identity. It's much simpler. It's what's God's sexual identity for us? How did he make us? Man, woman, boom, end of story. So that's what we need to integrate into authentic chastity, and we're just about there with chastity. This is hugely important because, again, this is who we are. And it's not that the LGBTQ label says too much about my identity. It's that it says too little. It says too little about us. Okay? And this is the same fundamental illusion that is at work in gender identity as a label. In other words, I feel, I've lived my life for now 50 years as a man, but tomorrow I may wake up and if my feelings suggest that I either desire the identity of a woman, then culture is going to say, go for it. Hopefully my friends are going to say, don't go for it, because there's nothing to go for. Think about the logic of this just at a fundamental level. If man and woman are our identities and gender is not, which is the truth, then isn't that the right answer to the question, how is it that a man could possibly know what it feels like to be a woman? How is it that a woman could possibly know what it feels like to be a man? A particularly poignant place to have that question asked and answered would be among married couples. You don't know what it's like, dear, to be, right? It's like, this is part of why, at a practical common sense level, most people understand that the realm of gender is very illusory here. When we speak of gender, if we speak of it, we speak of masculinity and femininity. And we root those terms in what it means to be sexed, S-E-X-E-D, to be sexed as man or as woman. What is masculine arises from the very being of being man, feminine from being woman. And our task is to, in this great, vast human family, is to connect the dots on those lived experiences and sharing our gifts and resources so that it just might rub off a bit on man and on woman, these various other traits that arise from within. In other words, a man could very well learn some incredibly important truths from woman's femininity and vice versa for women. So with all of that on the plate, quickly touch on this one subject of desensitization. It's just a reality. I just want to point it out. It's the slowly boiling frog, right? We have lived for decades now with orientation. If you were to go back and just look at art, entertainment, news, politics, legal system, all of those things, that once the decision was made that orientation is an identity, and therefore is a community, and therefore is a minority, and therefore is a political force, and therefore, then it needed to become normal for society. It's amazing, if you go back and look at sitcoms from the late 60s, early 70s into the 80s, how much plowing of the field was happening for desensitization. I'll just leave it at that for time purposes right now. We could have a whole conversation about that. Right now, we get to experience that with gender, because right now, that's what culture is proclaiming. It's a much less slow boil, because the slippery slope has already happened. We've already been down this road, so now it's all the more easy to do this in the realm of gender. Okay, with all of that as backdrop, we have about 5 minutes that I'm going to give to chastity and as a response to this. Firstly, chastity must be understood in terms of the dignity of the human person as an interior reality. It is merely not enough to say, well, I'm not doing this or that with my body, therefore I am being chaste, right? We know Matthew 5 and Jesus, and speaking of adultery in the heart, we know that this is a truth, that this is a reality, that we don't even move to an action that would be considered a sexual act without first having this interior struggle or not to say yes or no to that. That's happening inside us first. We have to really focus on that and not think in terms of just what we're doing on the outside. It's an integration of our sexual identity, as I mentioned a moment ago. If I'm a man, I need to integrate my being a man and my being masculine, whatever that might mean, into everything I do. It doesn't mean that if I identify as gay, that I need to integrate my experience as being, quote, gay, unquote, into that identity. That would be a wrong understanding of what the church proposes for integration and for chastity and for purity of heart. So another example of that, well, I want to mention one catechism quote, 2360, because it says so concisely what sexuality is. It's not that there are plurals, sexualities. There's sexuality. Catechism 2360. Sexuality is ordered toward the conjugal love of man and woman. Boom. Conjugal meaning marital, right? So marital, spousal love between man and woman. So that's what we are called to integrate into the rest of our lives. And that's a tough challenge for people who experience same-sex attraction. We are also making a distinction between this idea of sort of, if we experience this on the inside, well, as long as I don't do these things, and maybe I just, instead of, going down a sex act pathway with another man, in my case, I'm just going to go out on a date with them, right? It's like, well, is that chastity? You're redirecting this initial inclination that is, it's like, is that chastity? Well, it's not on an interior level if you're counting yourself as a date and if you're viewing this relationship as a couple relationship, right? So there's more at stake here. This is oftentimes what you might hear referred to as sublimation, right? It may be possible to, in the psychological term, sublimate, to redirect what could be an emotion or attraction that is in itself good, but not. But we can't just do that with desires that are a deprivation of the good, of what God's plan is for us. Really, what we're called to do, we have to say no to that. And so we have to say no in our wills, in our souls. And so that's where the cross is really, really tangible. We also have to pay attention to identity labels, right? The idea of, is coming out a healthy thing? Is it in keeping with chastity or not? There's a lot to be said about that, but time isn't going to permit it right now. But the idea that if you're announcing publicly that this is who I am, not what I experience, but who I am, and this is something good about me such that I want to let the world know, then there's more work that needs to be done on the inside regarding chaste living. There's a remedy that God gives us. So, this sounds pretty dismal right now. Like, oh, great. The remedy for all of these experiences of desires that are deprivations of the good, God has always given us the remedy. It's called grace. That's very simple. When we speak about how do we get ahead of the curve, how do we channel in, how do we say no consistently when things beyond our control, things that just happen inside us, we experience, we just have to lean into the grace that God gives us, because that was his original plan for us. Are any of you familiar with, like, before the fall, the story of Adam and Eve? And have any of you heard of preternatural gifts? God gave us preternatural gifts. Awesome, God, thanks. Why didn't we get to keep those after Adam and Eve fell? One of those gifts, simply put, was the grace to never have a disordered desire. It was part of what grace did to our human nature. We would always experience and then will the good in terms of what our senses told us. It's like speaking specifically of certain appetites like food or in the realm of sexuality. We would never have a stray sexual impulse in that graced reality. So that's on the front end. After the fall, concupiscence is the big 25-cent word that describes, okay, we got all these emotions and things happening within us, and it's like, I'd like to control that, but I'll just let that go, boom. And we suddenly, some form of quote-unquote disordered desire unfolds within us, and that's the world in which we live, because that's the wound to our nature as a result of sin. It's not that our nature is not good. This is a hugely important, and then I'm going to land the plane here and let you ask questions. Hugely important point, and this is something that the church is very susceptible of. It's because we teach that this inclination that is experienced in same-sex attraction, that it is a deprivation of good, and the language used is that technical language of objectively disordered inclination, right? And if someone believes that is because, or that my attraction is my identity, when they hear that, what are they going to think? The church says I'm disordered. The church doesn't think my human nature is good. It's just referred to me in this very terrible context, which is why it's so crucial to be able to say there's a separation here. We uphold every person's human dignity, even in the process of making sure that reality remains in focus. And we separate that reality precisely because we want to make sure that the inherent dignity of the human person is preserved. So with all of that, grace is a remedy. Psychological counseling in the more contemporary context of getting some form of therapy or counseling in the psychological realm, that's all possible. One thing to say, though, is let's not call that orientation change as a goal. Because if at the front end we're already saying, well, orientation is basically an ideology, it's not what we're trying to change that. It's that we're trying to help the person heal. That's as simple as it can be. We want people to heal. And so if we can help them either reduce the level at which they are experiencing these attractions, or if we can simply equip them more to deal efficiently when they occur, then we're helping them heal. And the psychological sciences can do that. CourageRC.org, Jot it down. CourageRC.org. It is the Courage and Encourage Apostolates. Those are the folks who know, after 30 years of experience as an apostolate, how to help people with growth in chastity and holiness and hope. I've been able to go to 2 different annual conferences in the last couple of years, and I see hundreds of people in those conferences that experience SSA, same-sex attraction, and it's amazing the kind of joy and fellowship and solidarity that's there in the common suffering and the common healing that is taking place. So we also, on the back counter, if you want, you can grab this wonderful book that there's a group within the Curia of the Archdiocese that produced this in March. It's called Hope and Holiness, and this is the subtitle of Pastoral Care for Those with Same-Sex Attraction. So some nuts and bolts, or at least some basics of how we understand unpacking a lot of what I just said, you'll find in this book as well. Okay, I have to be quiet now because I'm already into your time. So I know that is a huge amount of stuff funneled into one short little channel here, which I hope means that you've got questions and you can tell me, where are you in this? So who wants to get us started? In the back.
Okay, I see 3 themes here. We have the church's teaching on what is healthiest in the long run for the individual, and research supports this, as well as for the good of society, preserving Judeo-Christian values. One theme. And then we have here those individual human beings we all know, and it turns out, in my case mostly, in retrospect, to find out they had homosexual tendencies or maybe living covertly a lifestyle. 2 themes. Then we have a third, a very divisive force, the secular agnostic agenda. Let's divide where we can, divide and conquer. If you're part of the church and try to support it, we're going to automatically accuse you of the haters of people with a homosexual tendency. Okay, that's the third. Now, I could use help in phrases, vocabulary, tactics, in trying to not let those divisive forces prevent me from upholding the church's view, which, in my understanding, is the most helpful to society and the individual in the long run.
Yeah.
And yet, be helpful and not confrontational to those individuals that can suffer from this.
Yeah. And this is so the question basically again is the idea of, these different scenarios that emerge in how we address this in a particularly pastoral way with individual, concrete, living human beings who experience this. And that is where, yes.
Well, also with society at
right.
large,
Right.
As the individual, you take care of that
Yeah.
individual person one-to-one.
Right.
But in talking with our friends.
Yeah, and it is good to realize that the distinction she just mentioned between sort of the social or common good aspect of this and the individual, those are different realities, and that is very much important to keep into focus, particularly in pastoral settings, right? Because it's a very different reality to be face-to-face, one-on-one with someone and to try and help them in their very concrete situation. And then it's also a very different situation to experience that globally or communally in the realm of common good. And the language is going to have to shift a bit in both of those situations because you're looking for good language. And the thing that I would say is so crucial is, there's a vocabulary that the church is using in its documents that is almost, it's a system of thinking that is expressed in a huge whole vocabulary. And so, I've kind of been, I find it ironic that, when people hear the word disordered, it seems to be the focal point. And yet, when in the church's teaching, it's objectively disordered inclination. How many of you can tell me what the church means by inclination? Or objectively, it sounds like kind of more normal human language in a sense, but those are technical uses. And they have to be understood in a certain way. So part of our task is how do we translate, how do we communicate these truths, these realities from which real freedom, real love must come into these situations. I don't know of many easy answers to this. All I know is, again, what do we lean on? We're going to have to lean on God's grace to give us the words, to ask the Holy Spirit to be the voice from within us that somehow says the right word at the right time to the right person, and then to be prophetic on the national or global or communal stage. We need to have the prophetic voice that still says these truths, that still proclaims these to the larger audience, at the risk of and at the likelihood of getting the pushback of, if you said disordered, you hate me. Boom. Is this conversation over? Okay. It's like, where do you go from there? Well, if all we are haters, it's hard to penetrate that. So, then other tactics, right? In terms of if you're looking to try and raise and elevate the level of discourse, maybe you have to be quiet for a while and just be there, be present, or focus on aspects of it that will eventually get you back into this particular concept. But that's a hard thing. I mean, I know that from experience. It's a hard thing. It's not going to come easy, and we need a lot of prayers. So that's a big question. But there's got to be more questions too. Yes?
All these technical terms are very good, and I understand them. I have a...
Could come talk to me afterwards, because I need some help.
I have a 26-year-old granddaughter who about 3-4 years ago told her parents that she was gay. Mm-hmm. This came as a total shock. And at the same time, we had a situation in our parish where a musician had come out that he and his partner were going to New York to get married. Mm-hmm. And because of that situation, he no longer could teach in the Catholic school. So she was aware of that, and she said, I'll never go to a church that would do that. Well, mm-hmm. I tried to explain those things to her.
Yeah.
How can I help her love the church again? She has a partner.
Yeah.
They have joined some kind of a large church
mm-hmm.
that welcomes gay people.
So how can we help people who are in the midst of living a life in which they're saying yes to same-sex attraction and to this reality, this unreality actually, but how can we help them fall in love with the church again? Yes. That's where I think we look at the example of Christ and say, to the effect or to the extent that we do not think that our actions will be scandalizing to anyone else, can we find ways to reach out simply in human relationship with individuals in that scenario, and that particularly family members? It may not be that you can ask this individual and her partner to Thanksgiving dinner with the whole community of your family because, well, how does that affect the young kids, right? That might be there. But it might be the case that you can reach out and say, you know what, I'd love to go to coffee with you sometime. And not with any intentional evangelical edge to what you're doing, but just do what Pope Francis is telling us, accompany, right? This is the art of accompaniment. This is the dining with tax collectors and sinners that moves a person's heart when oftentimes it's so immersed in this deprivation of good. It's devoted to it. Our minds, our senses, our emotions. Believe me, from my experience with those with SSA, this is a very deep-rooted reality in their lives in terms of this experience. And so it shapes so much of their thinking, their feelings, their choices. And we have to try to help them navigate that. But sometimes if that immersion is so great, it's going to be very hard to persuade. Rather, we're going to have to do what Jesus did and say, it's time to accompany, and then see where the Holy Spirit leads that. Because oftentimes, if their first response is, I will never be part of a church that does this to these people, and yet you're part of that church, and you do this to this person, to her, this being this very, very self-giving act, then that's going to have to change the equation in her mind.
Well, the acceptance of the family is not a problem, not a bit. But, and she, one day she called me up and she said, Grandma, do you have a crucifix I could have? And I said, oh yeah. She said, I want to put it above my bed.
Yeah.
She reads the Bible. She's a Catholic grade school, high school, and college graduate. So, I guess prayer is what I've been working on.
Prayer is the perfect immediate response, and then when you see opportunities for concrete acts of accompaniment, say yes to those if you can. Yes. Oh, yes, right over here.
You mentioned the slippery slope and that this didn't just come about. It's been going on for years and years. And I remember going to a workshop many years ago at Maryville University when the Equal Rights Amendment, they were working on that. And in this agenda, part of it under population control was how can we bring about better population control, and a push for homosexuality is part of that agenda because that will cut down on population.
Interesting.
And I would think it would be helpful to get that information out because people are being manipulated, especially our young people who are very confused when they get into their teenage years as to, the sexual orientation.
Right.
And they'll say, well, you're too young to date, but you can do stuff with the girls, and so that's all gets misconstrued.
Yeah.
But if they realize, and people start realizing that this is part of an agenda.
Right. So.
Yeah.
So the question, again, to repeat for recording, is the idea of can we not be more clear to folks about how intentional so much of this really is, and that there's a lot of coordination that happens on these fronts out there in our culture. I mean, we see that definitely as true. The irony being, at a particular time, and not too long ago, this idea of, wouldn't promoting homosexual relationships be a good way to reduce population, except that we don't seem to have that luxury anymore either with the advent and dawn of same-sex marriage and same-sex adoption and same-sex child rearing. Like, what did I read? A statistic, very interesting statistic. It was either 2 million or 3 million children right now being raised in same-sex families. And a lot of that is, the result of the type of technologies that we would say would be very immoral, because, the types of baby making that's going on is not conducive to human flourishing, as they say. So yeah, this is a brave new world, and even in that we're seeing, that these are folks who that the intentionality of that is it's very clear, but they've achieved a lot, they being people who have promoted and proposed things like same-sex marriage enshrined in law. They have achieved a lot of their agenda already.
Jim, there's a
Yes.
book, a very secular book, it's not a religious book, it's called The Marketing of Evil. I can't think of the author's name, but he traces how the homosexual has marketed itself, how other evils in our society have marketed themselves to show that. And it's has nothing to do with religion. It shows people. It's a very good book.
So another good book called The Marketing of Evil, and then I would also put a plug in for a book by Robert Riley with Ignatius Press. A couple of years ago, wrote a book called Making Gay Okay. It's Ignatius Press, and it too takes a non-religious, basically journey through the recent history of social, legal landscape, primarily legal landscape, and it shows the connecting of these dots that you're mentioning. So, yes, right here.
Do they have workshops where we can go to learn some kind of terms or to go over what you've just done so that we can role play and also to, I don't know how to word this, orientate ourselves when you look at someone who says, I have the man, and he says, I have a partner that's a
Yeah.
man. Because to
Right.
relate, I'm looking at him as a man.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you relate to, are you the man, or the wife, or the husband?
So relate.
Fit into the,
So-
that when you're asking
Yeah.
questions, or you're trying to present this.
So two aspects are being asked right now. One is, are there workshops that could help in terms of even role-playing or getting a handle on interaction that we're going to have, and particularly interaction in cases in which we're being confronted in ways we've never been confronted before. Particularly, this is going to come into larger focus the more obvious or prevalent the population of transgender folks will continue to grow and continue to have a presence that's visible and public, and intentionally so. So the short answer to the workshop question is, I don't know of any local resources yet, but I do know. Exactly. I mean, she mentioned START. Absolutely. That's in fact part of our internal sort of study group that produced this document. That's here, Hope and Holiness. We're looking at those very things and what are the next steps. We did study days in the early part of this year that help people, hopefully get some foundation, but then what are the next steps? Workshops like that would be great. The idea of relatability, that's,
When they say this, you say that.
yeah, those,
Is there a definition or technicality terms in your book that?
not in this one.
So that you can really
Right.
understand what this word
So,
means?
yeah, one aspect about it is if we were ever to kind of look for a book that would basically say, when someone says this, you say that, I would look at that as a resource that could be a generic resource. So it could give you ideas. The thing that I would probably never suggest will work well is the idea of just sort of having the canned response, right? But rather, how does, okay, that's going to trigger something. If I get a resource like that, it's going to trigger something that may be useful to me in a real conversation. But it may be, your experience might be different enough in that concrete situation here and now that, maybe it's going to be the Holy Spirit that's going to help you with that too. But there are, sort of practical, relevant ways of kind of capturing the essence of this that might be good sort of general resource.
People to lead those groups, would they be better maybe to people who have been shown the light and understand, so
Yeah.
that they can relate to the ones that are?
Yeah, there is so the question of, isn't it good for us to be guided a lot by people who have had experiences like this? And it helps me remember to say another thing that would be helpful for you to maybe as a resource after today is if you go online and look at everlastinghills.org, just everlastinghills.org. You're going to find a documentary film that's done very well. It's called Desire of the Everlasting Hills, is the documentary, and it tells the story of 3 people who have experienced same-sex attraction and their journey initially away from and then back toward purity of heart, chastity, and an embrace of God's identity for them. It's a beautiful, beautiful documentary, everlastinghills.org. And that speaks to the idea that even the Courage Apostolate will say that our best ambassadors are our members, right? They have lived it, and they have come back to embrace the call to chastity, and they tell their stories, and that's the most persuasive avenue we seem to have for helping people's heads and hearts change. So what else we got? Oh, yes, I'll repeat the name, everlastinghills.org, one word. And if you go to the Courage Apostolate, too, you'll find it, a link to it there, Courage RC.
But didn't you name the name of the documentary?
The documentary is called The Desire of the Everlasting Hills. Yeah. And question was over here?
Yes. If you would ever receive an announcement from 2 lesbians that they were having a baby, for the sake of the child, would it be okay to say something, know that baby will be loved? Or do you acknowledge it, or even though you don't approve of the relationship? How do you handle these issues like that?
Yeah, so the example given of a case in which two women have a baby announcement sent your way. And what do you do? Well, recognize, number one, it's not the baby's fault, right? This is very much why we're here today at a Respect Life conference. And so what will be in the best interest of that child? Will it be that, is this a situation in which there's no avenue for accompaniment, or is there an avenue for accompaniment? In other words, can you reach out and say, like you said, choosing your words carefully because you don't want to convey affirmation of things that you would not affirm, but you certainly want to pray for the child, right? God bless the baby, and if you need anything, let me know. That could be depending on the relationship you have with the persons. There could be other concrete acts of accompaniment that you could consider as well. And at some point, if you know each other well, a couple in that situation will know that, I know that this person who's being really helpful and open to me doesn't believe at all in this relationship I have. And maybe that will become a topic of conversation because you've left the lines of communication opening. So that would be one way. Every case is going to be very different because it's going to it could involve other children, it could involve things that make it, you can't take the next step of accompaniment unless and until this changes or that changes. So realities like that do play, have a place in how you discern. Other questions? We are down to 4 minutes before 3 o'clock. Right over here.
Questions about psychology and psychological services. Like if you know people in lesbian or gay relationships and you want to say something versus like one of my former friends just announced that her daughter got married to another girl, another woman. Are there services now, like Good Catholic Family Service, that are
Yes.
talking to them?
So the question of where can you go for help, right?
Yeah.
There are certain counselors, I believe, in our area who could be tapped as resources for this. And our office, the Office of Laity and Family Life, could be a point of contact for getting in touch with such resources in a psychological sense. And also keep in mind that St. Louis has chapters of the Courage Apostolate here, both for people with SSA, the Courage Apostolate, and then Encourage is a partner. It's also part of that apostolate, but it's for parents and family members. It could even be husbands and wives of someone who have said, I'm gay and I'm leaving. So Encourage is a great resource for people sort of struggling with that. And then if you go to the national website that I mentioned, you'll also see, I think, some other resources for people who are in the psychological sciences, who actually, are go-to professionals and experts in this area. One of the board members of Courage is Dr. Timothy Locke, and he is a professional psychologist, and we had a video presentation from him in March as part of our study days here in the Archdiocese. So there are folks like Dr. Locke who are out there and others who provide good, solid, sort of basic information, and then locally some resources that could put you in touch with real counseling. And with that, we have a 2-minute warning. Any last question to kind of put an exclamation point, or yes?
What's being done in the high schools because we're losing them there?
What's being done in the high schools? Oh, yes. Well, just in short, we have that on really the top tier of our area that we want to address and are addressing. There are obviously, in relation to this area, there are things that are, in terms of Catholic education, that are part of the landscape already. There are things that are evolving in terms of how to respond to things like, okay, what if John shows up next week and he wants to be known as Jane? Then what do you do? And so there are, when we look at like CYC, our Catholic Youth Council for Sports, they have some already. They have produced some guidance already. We're working on crafting more and more guidance in that particular arena too. So pray for that, because that, as you say, we have to get to folks as early as we can with this plan that God has for us. Yes?
Again, wouldn't it be beneficial if even for the young people to know that this started with an agenda? That it's just not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and in a Catholic context, we can just say very quickly, I mean, the agenda is ancient, because this is the agenda of the serpent in the garden, you know, and this is where but there are people who definitely coordinate to make it even harder for us to produce the truth.